Bom dia a todos. Nós vamos falar em inglês hoje, porque foi o modo como foram convidados. Suponho que não haja problema. O problema é para mim. So thank you very much for coming. It's a great pleasure to receive you again. It's not the first time you are coming here. I'm very pleased for your presence, as well as the fact that now, today, we have also Luis Augusto Castro Neves, who is the chair of SEBRE. SEBRE is the more important thinking group in Brazil regarding to international relations. And we are now trying to gather some events, so you are inaugurating this series of events. We are very happy, and I will shut up immediately. Sorry, I came as if I was going to a football match. But I was not expecting so many bankers among ourselves. Thank you very much. I don't know if you want to say some words, Luis Augusto. Go ahead.
Just to thank you, just to thank IFHC for this partnership, and remind the fact that you yourself are not only chairman of the IFHC, but also the honorary chairman of SEBRE, which is a great honor for us. And also to thank Iam Bremmer for his willingness to come here and say a few words about what is going on, what is happening in the globalized world, and what would be its possible impacts on Brazil's. I won't abuse of my time, and I would, if you agree, Mr. President, pass the floor to Iam Bremmer.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. I mean, if you want to be honorary chairman of Eurasia Group, you are very welcome, sir. It's not, just want to let you know.
Task asset.
Okay.
Go there.
Hope you heard that. I hope you're. Look, first of all, it's a delight to be back in Brazil. We opened our office here just a year ago. I cannot imagine a better welcome as someone who does international relations to this country than to have IFHC and SEBRE and the two of you fine gentlemen and friends being a part of it. So I'm honored with that, and I really thank you. I thank both of you. I'd like to make this as informal as possible. I'm not dressed for a football match, but close. And so I don't want to speak for a long time, but I want to say just enough so that we can get the conversation going, and I suspect it's going to be very lively with this group. Let me first say, big picture, that during the Cold War, the geopolitical environment was dangerous but stable. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the last 25 years, the geopolitical environment was unstable, but not so dangerous. We are now entering a period where the geopolitical environment is both unstable and dangerous. And that is obvious. It's obvious from reading the headlines. You cannot, let me just mention a few that are sort of interesting. The fact that we've had the special relationship of the United States, the UK, just a week ago, say no to the US and become founding members of the China-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, joined by some 40 states, including most of America's allies around the world, in short order. The fact that Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu from Israel came to the United States against the explicit instructions of President Obama to try to undermine a nuclear deal on Iran. The framework agreement will be announced, I believe, in the next few hours. 47 Republican senators writing a letter to the Iranians explaining how the American Constitution works. The Turks, a NATO ally, saying that they are going to buy a Chinese missile system that is not interoperable with NATO allies. The Greeks, a NATO ally, referring to Ukraine as a neo-Nazi state, accepting, the Prime Minister Tsipras, the annexation of Crimea by Russia. 10 rounds of sanctions by the United States against Putin, or else, and President Putin choosing or else. Failed states in Yemen, Libya, Syria, Iraq, more refugees than we've seen at any point since World War II, and the most powerful terrorist organization and best funded and best armed and trained that the world has ever seen. Those are just the headlines. You cannot tell me this is coincidence. This is not just happening, right? And what makes it more problematic is the fact that this period of greater geopolitical instability and danger is one that is felt less acutely by the United States than by most other countries. It's felt acutely in Europe. It's felt acutely in the Middle East. It's felt acutely in Eurasia. It's felt reasonably acutely in Asia. It's not felt acutely in the United States. And that's a big part of this as well. So maybe a couple things I'll say. First, just about why this is happening, and secondly, about some of the implications on the ground and some of the conflict spots that we see. Why is this happening? Well, a big part of it is the U.S. Yes, of course, Obama, not a foreign policy president, and his second-term team, not so strong. We know that. Also, Iraq and Afghanistan, wars that cost $3 trillion, not popular in the United States. But let me add a point to this. And the energy revolution, the U.S. not as interested in the Middle East. Sure. But let me add a point to this, which is that if we think about 21st century tools of American power, we don't talk as much about boots on the ground. We talk about surveillance and cyber. We talk about drones. We talk about the weaponization of finance, the use of the U.S. financial institutions and access to the dollar as a stick to get what America wants. Now, what I find interesting about those tools, you look at Obama. Obama's not an isolationist. America's not becoming isolationist. On all of those issues, America is more interventionist today than it was 5 or 10 or 20 years ago. But it's also more unilateralist. It is working less closely with allies. Allies feel less special. They are more concerned. They want to know, what does America stand for? Where is the role that we play? Obama's a part of that, but we're going to have a new president in 2017. It's not going to change that fundamentally. Those trends that I mentioned are still going to happen. Another piece, of course, is that American allies are less interested in following the role of the U.S. We certainly see this. I mean, you go to Japan right now, Japan's top ally in the world, who is Abe closest to? Today it's India. Today it's Prime Minister Modi. Feels much more certain about that long-term trajectory than the United States. Believe it or not, that's very surprising. And we could talk about that if you like. The British relationship is close to the U.S., but the Germans are more important. And the German-U.S. relationship, not close at all. I was in Beijing a couple months ago, met with the ambassador, U.S. ambassador. Off the record, I'll tell you that they have a small group that's trying to deal with things like Chinese cyber attacks, industrial espionage, intellectual property theft, and they meet with American allies. They meet with the New Zealand, the Australian ambassador, Japanese, Canadian. They meet with the French, the Brits. I said, what about the Germans? Oh, no. The Germans don't want to participate. Germans feel like they have a good relationship with China, commercial relationship. They don't want to talk about security issues. They don't talk about the East China Sea, the Dalai Lama. They don't talk about that. So that's a challenge. You know, it's very hard for a United States that's acting more unilaterally to coordinate with a Germany that looks at the world more geoeconomically, not geopolitically. That's harder. And then, of course, you have China rising, Russia declining. A couple quick points on that. The Chinese, I really believe, do not want to rock the international security order. They believe that some of the steps they took when Xi Jinping first came in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, were overly aggressive, and the reactions from countries in the region moved them closer to the U.S. They didn't like that. The reactions in Vietnam or Singapore, the Philippines, the reactions in Japan, they didn't like that. And so they've backed away from that. And they also know that globally, China's ability to actually compete with the U.S. is nowhere for decades. Whether it's peacekeeping or anti-piracy or defending sea lanes, dealing with problems in the Middle East, that's not it. But I will tell you that China absolutely wants to challenge the American economic order. And they have come to that decision over the past few years. The creation of alternative architecture, the Chinese Development Bank, the BRICS Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the maritime and overland Silk Route initiatives, the desires to have petroleum denominated in RMB in the Middle East, the efforts to have bilateral local denominations of deals with countries, particularly in the region, but also more broadly. This will subvert the U.S.-led global economic order. It will cause more fragmentation. So as I look out over the next 10 years, I look at companies like Amazon and Apple and Google and Facebook, which are transformative companies, and they're worth a lot of money. But they all are the same company. They all want to do the same thing. They all go from smartphones to wearables to, within 10 years, implantables. And the fact is that they want to intermediate between all of us and the market. And here's the catch. The Chinese absolutely will not allow those companies to dominate in the Chinese space, nor in spaces where the Chinese government has the ability to dominate economically. Now, today, those countries are small. Laos, Cambodia, a couple authoritarian states in sub-Saharan Africa. In 10 years' time, South Korea. 10 years' time, Russia. Then life gets interesting, right? Then life gets interesting. And we're going to see that globalization is going to keep going. It's getting faster and faster. People and money and ideas are transforming the world, and borders are becoming more and more porous for everything. And yet, Americanization, which was largely analogous to globalization for much of the post-war order, Americanization is not continuing. Americanization is receding. America's not in decline. American foreign policy is in decline. Two different things. That's interesting. And so I think the rise of China is really going to facilitate this fragmentation, and also the decline of Russia. And I should talk a little bit about that. The decline of Russia, there is no question that most Russians were waiting for 20 years for someone to stand up and tell the Americans, we are not going to take it anymore. Whatever you think about that, whatever I think about it, they were waiting for it. If we put ourselves in their shoes, they were sick of what they considered to be lies on NATO enlargement, what they considered to be lies on missile defense in Eastern Europe, what they considered to be lies about American energy policy in Russia's backyard and their sphere of influence, and what they considered to be lies on Ukraine, their single most important foreign policy interest. I am not saying this to criticize American policy. I'm saying this to put ourselves in the view of the Russians who are behaving in ways that we don't like. And so when Putin stood up and said, that's it, we are going to put Ukraine, we're going to take matters into our own hands. This was enormously popular in Russia. But Putin did not count on oil prices going down 50% right after he did that. And that puts him in a box. That's a much bigger problem for him than sanctions. And Putin also did not count on the former deputy prime minister of Russia and a lead opposition figure, Boris Nemtsov, did not count on him being assassinated. Now, this is personal for me. I knew Nemtsov well. We wrote an article together in the New York Times the week after Putin was elected in the year 2000. And we said, you know what? Putin's not a Democrat. But right now, he's probably the best Russia can do. Painful to look back on that now. But Nemtsov's murder, which was right outside the Kremlin, was not ordered by Putin. He didn't want it. But I tell you, it was an inside job. The assassination, the fact that there was a snowplow that went right in front, you couldn't see what happened, the fact that all of the surveillance cameras from the Kremlin were broken or pointed someplace else, and then Putin's gone for 11 days. Coincidence? No, no. The one thing, if you are in his position, you have to show everyone you have control. And if someone guns down Nemtsov inside the Kremlin and you didn't order it, you got to deal with that. So what I see happening in Russia is a very powerful guy who is very angry at the U.S., that is starting to feel his own power slip. And he is absolutely willing to act out as a consequence of that. And that's not just in Ukraine. That's cyber. That is military encroachments into Europe. It's submarines. It's air force that could lead to an accident. The kind people were worried about between China and Japan, what was never very dangerous, it's very dangerous between Russia and Europe. the potential for a continued slippery slope towards invasion in places like the Baltic states and Poland. They're not going to line up tanks and go into Estonia. But 3 months ago, they went across the border, they jammed the radio frequencies, they used smoke grenades, and they took an Estonian border guard, they brought him to Moscow, he's in jail right now. And I asked the Estonian president a few weeks ago, why didn't you say much about that? He said, we don't want to antagonize the Russians more than we have. Let them focus on someone else, right? It's like, you know, you got a volcano, occasionally you need to throw in a sacrifice and hope that that appeases the gods, right? It's the same, maybe Latvia next turn, right? So absolutely I worry about this, and I do think the geopolitical environment is extremely dangerous. Before we turn to discussion, let me say a few things that are, well, let me say one more negative thing and then a few things that are positive. No, I haven't talked about the Middle East yet, and so, I don't know. Middle East is imploding. No, I mean, I think that we're we're entering a G0 world, not a G7 or G20. A lot of you probably know that. And in a G0 world, the Middle East is the first primary casualty, right? I mean, we see this, that right now the Saudis don't count on the Americans as much, neither in Iraq, nor in Syria, nor in Yemen, nor anywhere else. And so as a consequence, what are the Saudis doing? They are building a Sunni military force. How's that going to work for the Shia? Not so well. Right? So are we going to see a bigger fight? Sure we are. Where's energy prices going to go in this environment? Not up. Why? Because we're about to get an Iranian deal. Right? I mean, we're going to have a framework agreement. Kerry's begging for it. And by the way, so are the Iranians. In a low energy price environment, they need it more. Their economy is under more pressure. So even the supreme leader wants to get this done. I'm not sure it'll be implemented well. And by the way, Iranian cyber capabilities are much more dangerous than nuclear capabilities, even if they develop a bomb. So let's be clear, we're not actually fixing this either way. But they're going to produce more oil. And Saudi influence, the Iranians are against the Saudis on every issue. Look, Congress doesn't like the Iranian deal. And Israel really doesn't like the Iran deal. But the Saudis truly, truly hate the Iran deal. Let's be clear what the ordering preference is right now, right? And that is going to cause a lot more conflict and proxy wars across this region. The Iranians are going to get much more influential. And the Americans are going to try to balance, but are not planning on sending boots in the ground. Unless you think this is just about Obama, let's be clear. I mean, I talk with McCain, I talk with Lindsey Graham. McCain wants to bomb a lot of countries, right? At least 12 by my count. But he doesn't want to put U.S. boots on the ground. He's not prepared to actually fight for Ukraine. He's not going to fight to get rid of Assad. I mean, the actual outcomes that we're talking about are not so different. They're not so dramatically different in this part of the world. So I do think we're going to see much bigger challenges. I don't think there'll be an Islamic State to speak of within 18 months. There are 30,000 men under arms in ISIS right now. They're paid about $500 a month. ISIS doesn't have the money to keep that up for another year. They're not going to get more banks like they got in Mosul. They can't sell oil the way they used to. They're not going to get money for kidnappings and ransom. And they're not getting checks from the Qataris or the Saudis. So where's the money coming from? So the Islamic State will fall apart. But ISIS, as Al-Qaeda 2.0, that's going to be much stronger. The social networking, the radicalization, the failed states, the refugees that aren't being treated well or integrated. No, that plays very well to ISIS, broadly speaking. Where? In the Middle East, in North Africa, in South Asia, in some of sub-Saharan Africa, and of course in Europe. In the US, I don't think so. In Brazil, no. In Japan, nope. China, nope. Russia, North Caucasus, yes. So that's interesting. Is there good news? Yes, there's good news. One big piece of good news is Asia. Biggest piece of good news, China. Single biggest beneficiary in the world of oil prices going down to $50, Xi Jinping. Because it allows him to continue with economic reform in a softer fashion. It allows him to actually make the policies work and not punish the SOEs as sharply. That's a good thing. Because the only thing worse than China succeeding is China failing. We don't want that, right? Brazil can't afford that. We know that. Now, this is a problem for Brazil because it means that the growth in China is going down, and it's going down in a stable way with the support of Xi Jinping and his cadre. Will they be buying as many commodities in that environment? No. Will they be forced to go back to the bad old ways of really inefficient resource intensivity? Not in the next few years. So that is a challenge for Brazil and many other countries in the world. But China itself will be stable. Xi Jinping, quite popular, charismatic. Another piece of good news. Abe, Modi, Joko, you've got real leadership right now. If I look around the world and I say, where's leadership? I mean, I see some leadership here, right? But if you ask me, where's leadership that's in power today, sitting elected power, right? It's basically Asia. It's those four guys. It's not the US. It's not Europe. It's not Russia. Egypt, Sisi, a little bit, especially talking about reforming Islam for lots of reasons that are interesting. That's much better than Mubarak was. So Egypt kind of working. But but kind of working. But when I think about, we can talk about that. I mean, I've got lots of conflicting views on Sisi. But when we talk about, everyone does, right? You can't look at Sisi and not have conflicting views. Sisi, it's very bipolar. It's very gestaltish, right? So when I think about, I like dropping gestalt in a kind of talk. When I talk about who's really doing it, and not only leading, but leading, not responding to crisis, but leading because they know it's the right thing to do strategically. It's Modi, Abe, Xi Jinping, and a little Joko. And that's really important because Asia is the fastest growing and most important economic region of the world. And it also means we're not going to see the fights near term. We're not going to see China go against Japan. As I look at Asia today, Asia's a pretty good story. Final good story, of course, is in a world, if I'm right, and if geopolitics are really just starting to experience a period of creative destruction that none of us have seen before, if that's true, then that means that the regions of the world that do not experience that geopolitical creative destruction will perform better. Because investors will be looking more for stability and resilience and less just for growth. What does Brazil have to teach us about growth these days? Not much. What does Brazil have to teach us about stability and resilience? Compared to the BRICS, a lot, actually. Much more consolidated, right? How about the United States? How about the Western Hemisphere? If I'm America, I love America's neighbors. We got Mexico, we got Canada. I mean, if you're Turkey, wouldn't you love to have neighbors like Mexico and Canada? Wouldn't that be fantastic? So, I mean, and two big oceans. I mean, and then, and then you've got South America. In South America, you've got Chavez, who's imploding, and you've got Kirchner, who's in a lot of trouble. And aside from that, do we have geopolitical challenges in the Western Hemisphere? We do not. Even Cuba, which was ostensibly your geopolitical challenge after 50 years. Oil prices fall apart. Venezuelans don't send them any money. Cubans living in America say, we don't care anymore. Castro's on his last legs. Let's do it. Put some Starbucks in within 5 years' time. No more Cuban regime, right? So, I mean, geopolitically, the Western Hemisphere looks good. And so, look, why did Eurasia Group decide to open its first office in an emerging market in Brazil? Well, first, because Mexico's close, so we can just go. But no, secondly, because come on, you're going to open in Russia? You're going to open in India, China? You're going to open in Brazil? Of course you're going to open in Brazil. Why? Because over time, Brazil's actually stable. Look, we have to put, if you can only do one, you can't do 20 flags. You can only do one flag. You want the one that over 10, 20 years' time is not going to come back and bite you. Brazil might be slow, but it's not going to come back and bite you, right? Geopolitically, the stability matters. The education matters. The industrialization matters. The real financial and business community, the elites, the bureaucrats, all of that is important in a way that, like in Russia, China, and India, the BRICS don't matter anymore. No one talks about the BRICS. Russia's a submerging market, right? China's bigger than all the rest of them combined, and the gap is growing every day. You can't talk about the BRICS. Talk about China as a macro driver, Russia as a revisionist state in perilous decline, and Brazil on the long-term path to becoming a developed state. That's interesting. It ain't the BRICS, right? So, I mean, that's now, since I can't quite end on a positive note, the negative story, of course, is that in an environment where geopolitics are more important and they're more stable here, there's less pressure to get it right. And that's particularly for the United States. U.S. doesn't need to legislate to get dollars to come to Washington. The U.S. doesn't need to do much, doesn't need to deal with the fiscal imbalances, doesn't need to deal with the defense misspending, doesn't need to deal with the pension problems, doesn't need to deal with paying for health care for a longer period of time, precisely because there's a desperate desire that's only going to grow, even if you're a Chinese millionaire, to put cash in stable places. And so you are going to have a safe haven curse that grows in the developed Western Hemisphere. And Brazil will experience some of that too, frankly. So anyway, I think it's a mixed story. It's a very interesting time. It's a great time to be in the field that we're all in. Lord knows there's so many moving pieces, and hopefully we can add some value. And once again, thank you. Thank you so much for having us here this morning. I'm looking forward to a very lively discussion with you all.
Well, thank you very much. A very fresh view over the global problems. And I would say that in general terms, I agree with you. Just to tell a very small story, then I open the debate. I have been very recently to Israel last year. And because of my friends, Brazilian friends who were with me, one day, one officer from the intelligence service, Israeli intelligence service, had a long conversation with me, a kind of, I don't know, transmission from the government to me about how the situation was with respect to Iran and Israel. And to my surprise, this guy was a general, told me that, well, you know, we make enormous mistakes with respect to Iran, because we estimate all time that Iran will take long time to build the bomb. Now we know that's no more true. It's a matter of months, maybe 1 year, they can do it. Secondly, now the problem is what to do. Let's go and do again what we, like we did with the Syrians and bomb the Iranian installations. So it's not easy because they are profound and they are dispersed. So it is not just one raid. It depends on several attacks. Probably the Americans are more appropriate to do that than we, because they are more close. They have bases surrounding. And neither Israel nor USA would like to risk to bomb because of the world public opinion. But anyhow, the main question is that they are capable to retaliate, and we will suffer the consequence of the bombing there. So the time is coming for negotiations. Well, why am I saying that? Because it seems to me that it's more realistic. I don't know if this is not Netanyahu's position. This was, you know, intelligence service person who said. But probably now, what will happen with respect to Iran will be a negotiation, because there is no alternative, either to bomb and to start a kind of atomic war, or to negotiate. Negotiate for what for? To control, to have some say, like the Americans did with India and Pakistan. And now the Saudi, they know that. So what are they claiming for? To have themselves their bomb. And this will introduce a new element in the disequilibrium across the area. But I think that this goes to sustain your viewpoint, fragmentation again. The situation imposed fragmentation. It's no more possible to control from a unique viewpoint what is going on in the globe. So we have to adapt to this moving scenario across the globe, just to support your views. So now the floor is open. I don't know if you want to make some comments at the beginning. The floor is open. Is as normally I would prefer to Sergio take care of say no to people. Come here, Sergio.
Could you speak a little more about the nuclear threat?
Nuclear.
Yeah.
Can we just collect 3 questions?
Yeah. Okay.
Mr. Bremmer, I wonder if you could speak a little bit more on how you see the development of democracy and the rule of law and the emergence of a liberal society in China. I ask that because, as you said, the only worst thing to have China succeeding as they currently are is to have them failing. And you said that they agree, and it's a good thing that they cannot compete geopolitically with the US globally, but they are trying to do that economically. But to have commodities denominated in dollars or to open an investment bank is not enough to succeed on that, because as you already said, people want to trade with China, to invest in China, but not to put their savings in China, not even the Chinese. And that depends on them evolving on that path in terms of democracy and rule of law and liberalism.
Last question here. And then in the second round, there will be opportunities for other people to speak.
Yes, I thought that the issue of the United States becoming self-sufficient in oil is becoming a very important geopolitical issue, which I don't think you mentioned, and if you did, you didn't put the importance that I'm giving, so I would like you to elaborate on that a little bit. Now, the second thing is that the initiatives that Saudi is taking in the Middle East seems to be something very favorable in the geopolitical arena, because it becomes very clear that the United States doesn't need to meddle into the rivalry of Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Well, the first one, let me start with the nuclear trends also, because the President also had a very, I think, important anecdote on that. Look, there's no question that the Iranians want to have strategic ambiguity like the Israelis do. They'd like to have nuclear weapons capability that nobody can stop, but not test a weapon. Because if they test a weapon, then the Saudis have to actualize their Pakistani nuclear program into actually nukes, and then other countries will also do so, right? So that's what the Iranians want to do, and of course the Israelis are strongly opposed to that. I think we should be very worried about that. Not because I think Iran would use nukes in the region, but because the level of control over nuclear material and technology is not what we'd like to see from Iran. And Iran has, you know, connections with Hezbollah, Hamas, other organizations in the Middle East that if they were to continue, if the Middle East trends were to continue, some of those will become desperate. And you worry about that. But of course, I'm more worried about Russia's nuclear weapons. I mean, I've seen a lot of Russian advanced military hardware in Chechnya get sold by desperate Russian soldiers and end up in the fight in the Middle East. And I got to tell you, given where Russia's headed with thousands of nuclear warheads, we should not feel comfortable about the disposition of one of the world's largest nuclear arsenals. We've already got Pakistan, we've got North Korea. This is clearly a bad trend. I'm still more worried about cyber. But, I mean, if you ask me, the proliferation genie is a very serious problem. It's not one we're about to get back into the bottle. So I also just want to say on Iran that, you know, part of the problem with Iran is if you don't do a deal, can the Americans maintain, because it's not a good deal. The deal, in 3 years' time, you get rid of sanctions, the Iranians will still have 12 to 15-month nuclear breakout capability. What happens if Iran then says, we don't like the deal anymore, we're going to develop weapons now? Can the U.S. get all those sanctions back in a more fragmented world? Nope. And then Iran's wealthier, and they've got nukes? That's not a good deal, right? But you have to look at the alternative. If America doesn't do a deal, the Russians break sanctions immediately. The Chinese will as soon as there's a good commercial reason. In 3 years, in 5 years' time, can America maintain tough international sanctions against a nuclear Iran? I don't think they can. And unfortunately, that puts the U.S. in a much more difficult position in negotiating this deal, which the Iranians know, and so they've driven a harder bargain, which makes the deal worse. I feel for the guys trying to negotiate this. Look, I don't think Kerry's the best Secretary of State the U.S. has seen. Don't get me wrong. He spent 18 months on Israel-Palestine as his top priority. That's almost a fireable offense, right? I mean, given how unlikely that was to do anything. It was narcissism from Kerry, right? It was like, I need a Nobel Prize. But on Iran, I feel for Kerry because he's in a very difficult position. There aren't great options here. And I think everyone's looking for him to pull out a great option. No one's suggesting what that great option is. I mean, Netanyahu came to the U.S. He didn't suggest what the better options would be. Netanyahu didn't say, let's bomb. He said, tougher sanctions. Great, you tell me who's going to do that. You think the Europeans, with their economic conditions today, are going to support tougher sanctions? That is not going to happen. The Chinese, the Russians, you've got to be kidding me. So Netanyahu's argument to Congress was a non-starter, but he didn't care. He was running for prime minister, which worked. So politically, Netanyahu did a great job. But strategically, for the Middle East, that wasn't his job, because he knows it's a non-starter. So, and he knows that an Israeli bomb is wrong for the reason that you suggested. He's absolutely right. The question about China. Do the Chinese need the development of democracy to succeed? Not in the near term, they don't. I think that's important to recognize. And I also think that, there are a lot of people that have presumed that if the Chinese Communist Party implodes, that it's going to look like what happened when the Soviets imploded, and that all the institutions won't work anymore. Keep in mind that China is getting much wealthier, and elites in China are getting much more vested in the system. And that necessarily means that if China implodes in 5 and 10 and 20 years' time, the result will be different than it would have been 20 years ago. Yeah. And the transition will be smoother. It'll be like, post-Spain, post-Franco. It'll be like South Korea. So I think a lot of the people that study China, the sinologists who grew up in the old communist days, including Kissinger, right, have not really internalized how much this change actually matters. They just haven't refreshed their model. And when China, you need to refresh your model a lot, because China changes. China today is nothing like it was 35 years ago. And the Chinese people are much happier generally. They're much prouder of their government. And I think that if you were to have democracy in China tomorrow, the result would be a government that is much more nationalist and much more antagonistic towards the West than what you have right now. And that is also a concern. I mean, democracy in Gaza did not get you Palestinians that the Americans wanted to work with, right? And we need to recognize that some of that history should be owned by the United States and Europe. The Chinese see that they used to be world beaters, and then they perceive that colonization basically kept them down from the Europeans, from the Japanese, supported by the Europeans, from others. And you're going to have to deal with that, right? They've got anyone that goes to China knows they've got a long, long sense of grievance. And they expect the world is turning in their direction. Right now, you see economic reform in China that's real. You see anti-corruption that's real. It's not complete. And certainly it's ring-fenced, as it needs to be, because if it wasn't ring-fenced, Xi Jinping could never get away with it. But it's not including political liberalization. I think for most Chinese, that's fine. I think 5% of Chinese, among the elites, would like to see a little bit more liberalization, at least in things like an independent judiciary, because they're worried that their own intellectual property will be stolen by other Chinese firms. So that's interesting. And if China continues to grow, that number could become 10%, 15%. And at some point, that will create more demand for liberalization of the Chinese political system. But I will tell you, I don't believe this is coming in the next 10 years. And given that China is likely to be the world's largest economy in the next 10 years, and no one can even deal with what that means, I don't think we have to worry about when that comes. When they finally realize that, wow, China can't become Singapore with 1 billion people, right? That model is not available to China. I mean, I accept that. I do accept that political liberalization matters, but I don't think it matters now. And that's what's interesting. And of course, also because a lot of political liberalization, America's ability to project its values on human rights and liberalism have been critically undermined by the inability of America to live up to exceptional standards over the last 20 years. Whether it was the election in the United States between Bush-Gore, and it was a partisan vote of the Supreme Court, whether it's Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, whether it's WorldCom or Enron or Lehman Brothers or the rest. I mean, I can go on and on, right? I mean, this is a challenge for the United States. And the fact that American politicians still completely believe, including Obama, in every bit as much exceptionalism as they did under Reagan, but that the actual living by those values at home doesn't really cut it, right? Torture, surveillance, right? I mean, these are challenges. A more transparent world, it makes it more problematic for the Americans to really promote their values abroad. And that absolutely allows the Chinese to say, you see, they do the same thing we do. When, I mean, come on. America screws up on human rights, but you cannot compare America and China. So that's not apples and oranges. That's apples and watermelon, right? I mean, that is like that's apples and trucks. It's a different concept. But the Chinese can use that. They can use the Snowden effect to say, look, the Americans do just what we do. No, the Americans, when the Americans spy on Brazil, they're not getting information for Petrobras and giving it to ExxonMobil. If they did, ExxonMobil would be more effective here, right? They don't do that. The Chinese, those companies get the information. They steal from U.S. Steel, Alcoa, Westinghouse. They take the information, they give it to Chinese companies who then use it, absent rule of law, to compete against the Americans. That is not the same thing. But the reality is that WikiLeaks and Snowden have degraded America's ability to actually have the high road, to take the high path. And that really hurts American soft power internationally. There's no question about that. It's damaged American relations with a lot of countries around the world. I did talk about energy, but briefly. I mentioned the energy revolution. I do think it was a piece. The reason I didn't spend much time on it is because I think it's now well understood in a way that the U.S. unilateralism is less well understood. But I absolutely agree with you that the fact that the United States gets no oil from Nigeria means that when Boko Haram becomes a challenge to the Nigerian government, the Americans go to Goodluck Jonathan and say, hey, if you guys don't do human rights, we're not giving you any money. We're not helping you with weapons. The U.S. doesn't say that to the Saudis, right? They don't tell the Saudis, if you don't stop whipping women that get caught by being raped, that we're not going to give you any weapons. We don't say that to the Saudis. But we do to the Nigerians. It's not because we don't care about human rights in one case, we do in the other. It's just in the Nigerian case, there are no other interests. In Saudi Arabia, there's still lots of other interests. And so the energy revolution has meant that America's interest in playing ball and in putting a lot of skin in the game in a lot of parts of the world. I mean, historically, U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East was driven quite a bit by oil. And today, much less so. Not zero. America still wants lower prices, and they still want oil to be produced in the Middle East. They don't want these things to crack down, but it's not as critical for the U.S. And I don't care if you've got Jeb Bush or Hillary or Scott Walker. I think that reality is only going to grow for American interests, particularly in the Middle East, but also sub-Saharan and a few other places too. So I agree with you. I do agree with you that it's good for the United States that the Saudis are playing a larger role. It is not clear to me how much of a larger role the Saudis want to have. I mean, in terms of ISIS, the Emiratis were playing the biggest role, and then they stopped because they said America wasn't doing enough. There's a lot of concern in the Middle East among the Gulf Arab states that they can't really take on radical Islam, at least not publicly, because it will undermine their own support base domestically. There's concern that they can't actually have boots on the ground attacking other Muslims because their own regimes are going to be made more brittle. And so the Saudis right now are building walls, expensive walls, with surveillance on their Yemeni border and on their Iraqi border. That's their, because they don't want this stuff to come across. Ultimately, I'm much more, why did Cuba open? Because Venezuela ran out of money. Why is Lebanon going to implode? Why will Jordan implode? Because the Saudis will stop paying what they used to pay when oil prices are 40 to 50 bucks and they're running big deficits. That's a serious problem. And I worry that the ability of the Saudis to drive an effective regional response to the lack of American power in the region will be constrained. And also, of course, it's going to be very conflictual with a much more powerful Iran over the next 5 to 10 years, in my view. But there's a lot. But for the Americans, this is not a horrible thing.
The scenario that you first described, how it can influence the next presidential elections in the United States. Will be, for instance, good for the Republicans?
I want to ask you about, you tend to have a view of a long-term low, $50 bucks a barrel, and that touches China, that touches Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Cuba, Venezuela. This is important for the picture that you've sold. And I just had some doubts. I wanted to hear more about your views on mid and long-term prices of oil, because all the shale revolution is very much based on a certain level of price of oil, and I have doubts whether the American production will be sustainable mid and long term. Although you have the Iranian and the Libyan may become oil coming more to the market. So in short term, of course, the price will stay low, but I want to hear you about that. And secondly, cyber. You keep talking about cyber, but could you tell us what's the real danger in cyber that I'm not so aware of, but this is for ignorance purpose, really. Thank you.
Good morning, my name is Décio Adoni. My question is about investments in Brazil. A few weeks ago, you published a report saying that the political risk in Brazil was increasing. Based on our interactions with the international investors, how do you see it? Do you think that they see that as a threat, or they see this as a buying opportunity in Brazil?
Let me start with the oil issue and cyber. You know, long-term view on oil is hard, but I mean, short to medium-term view. You know, certainly, again, Iran coming on is significant. OPEC fragmenting, meaning there's no more mechanism that can coordinate the withdrawal of oil in an effective way, means that there's going to be less of a public good around it, and that, of course, leads to more production, not less. The fact that in the United States, policies on shale have been very industry-friendly. They've been driven at the state level, not at the national level. Some of that, like in North Dakota, includes actual subsidies from the state if oil prices go down. I think there'll be consolidation in the sector. I certainly think that there'll be some oil coming off over the course of the next 6 months. But the view of our energy practice is it'll be much less than the IEA presently expects. And over the longer term, of course, the shale revolution is not just about the United States. It's also about lots of other countries. It's Eastern Europe, it's China, it's Argentina. Some of those will be slower to come on, some longer. Though my history with people telling me that China is going to take 20 years to do something and then doing it in 5 is that they tend to improve their efficiency and technology in various ways, with various means, more quickly than we think. And so I think there are lots of reasons to believe that more oil is coming onto the markets than less over the coming years. And I also think that, you know, you look at ISIS and the geopolitical risk. I mean, you know, they've taken over a piece of Iraq that's bigger than Lebanon, about 22% of the country by geography, and Iraq is still producing more oil than they have at any point in the last 35 years. Why are they doing that? Well, because they don't produce anything on ISIS territory. And that's why ISIS is there, is because there are no resources. But they're not going to be able to take territory with major production. And I think that's also true for Boko Haram. That's also true for a lot of the terrorism you're going to see in radicalism in the regions, the failed state regions that don't actually have the investment interest. So on balance, I mean, I'm not speaking much. I'm not an economist, and I'm not focusing as much on the demand side. But on balance, we would say not necessarily a $40 environment, but simply that over the course of the short to medium term, energy prices are likely to be sustainably pretty low. You know, and even if it's 60, I mean, that's still a very different environment for the Russians than we've seen historically, and a much more challenging one. It's a much more different environment for the Saudis, for others in the Saudis, their population is exploding, and they need to pay for that. And stability is a problem for them over time, and security needs are going to grow, and they aren't going to get as much money from the U.S. I mean, the challenges for these petrostates are going to grow even in a high energy environment, and we expect they're going to be lower. So, cyber, I mean, I thought it was really interesting. So the Americans and the Israelis attack Iran pretty regularly on the cyber front. Now, when you attack a country with missiles, the missiles blow up. When you attack a country with cyber, those viruses exist and they can be reverse engineered. And the Iranians have done that very quickly. And a couple of years ago, they had an attack on Saudi Aramco with a virus called Shamoon that was a reverse engineered American-Israeli virus. And they came within 2 hours of shutting down all Saudi production. Probably just for a day, but still. And they destroyed all of Saudi Arabia, Saudi Aramco's servers. 30,000 servers had to be destroyed, every single one. We've seen this also going after Qatar, Riscos from Qatar. These cyber concerns are serious, and the Russians have also, I mean, WikiLeaks and making transparent major, sort of classified documents. North Korea showing that they could actually get into Sony. No one thought North Korea had that capability. Now, the Americans then shut down all of North Korea's ISPs. They had over 1,000 of them. That's not many. But they're located in China, which means that the Americans had to get Chinese complicity to do it, which is pretty interesting, right? Because that means that the Chinese were not happy with what North Koreans did, and they're willing to work with the U.S. to slap them down. That's a good sign. But if you ask me, if the Russians get angry, are they going to have a big attack on a Western bank that could make that a mess? That could force the shutdown. Because if you had a Sony-type attack on a Western bank where all their files are public, proprietary trading positions, the rest, that could be the end of that bank. That could require, that could be bankruptcy terms. Absolutely. I mean, look, Putin is the most powerful single individual in the world, right? And the United States, the policy of the U.S. is not to go after Russia. It's to go after Putin, people around him, punishing them, right? It's closing down their bank accounts. It's taking away their private planes. It's impounding their apartments. It's trying to make them pressure him to change his behavior. He is not going to change his behavior. So from Putin's perspective, this isn't punishing Putin. From Putin's perspective, this is regime change. If you're the world's most powerful person and you're facing regime change, and by the way, when you lose power, you don't typically just lose power in Russia, right? It's worse than that. I think Putin's willingness to do dangerous things is high. They shot MH17 out of the sky by accident, but it happened. They came within a couple seconds of a Russian military jet hitting an SAS commercial aircraft 3 weeks ago in civil aviation space. And then you would have had 300 dead Europeans directly hit in European airspace by a Russian jet. You know what's going to happen then? Sanctions against SWIFT. You know what's going to happen then? You're going to see banks default in Europe because they can't get the money from Russia because they won't be able to pay. That's serious. So I think people don't understand that there are real fat tail risks right now around Russia, and cyber is a very, very big part of that. Presidential elections, I think the impact is that United States foreign policy is actually going to be a bigger part of this election, which is interesting because it wasn't in the last two elections. No. But it's going to be for a couple of reasons. First of all, the U.S. economy is rebounding fairly significantly, and Obama's approval ratings have gone up as a consequence, so you won't be able to hit them as much on that. But also, Hillary Clinton's attachment to Obama is foreign policy. And, 4 years ago, you could complain about Benghazi, but then Obama could say, hey, I killed bin Laden. Today, you can complain about everything I just talked about, right? And so, I actually think that they're going to try really hard to hit Hillary on foreign policy. Now, whether or not that's effective depends on who the candidate is, because Scott Walker is just not credible on foreign policy. But Jeb Bush is. It's not bad. On trade, he's great. On other foreign policy issues, he's got a great team. And by the way, his team is very similar to Hillary's team, so politically they're not all that different. But that will clearly be a big part of the election. And I've spoken with Jeb's team about that, and I've spoken with Hillary's team about that, and they expect this to happen, which is interesting. I don't know that it's a GOP advantage. I think that Hillary is, unless her health has a problem, she's clearly the nominee, and she has an incredible machine. She's going to make a lot of money, and women will vote for her. I think that the Republicans is a wild card much more because Jeb is not necessarily the nominee. There's easily 5 to 7 credible candidates on the Republican side. The big advantage for the GOP is that people like Jeb will not need to tack to the right to win because the Tea Party is weaker and because the candidates come from across the spectrum. So it'll be more competitive all the way across, all the way through, and that's more interesting. So I think the GOP will be able to field a strong candidate, and I think it's going to be this will be a very interesting election. It'll be an election probably with 2 very capable people. The last election was, oh my God, do we have to vote for Obama again? He's not that good. And oh my God, Romney is such a non-candidate, right? No one was excited about that election. This is an election people are going to get fairly passionate about. It's going to be more heated. The issues are going to matter, and they're going to matter more to Brazil. And I'll say that, I'm not the Brazil expert here, but in terms of the international community, we definitely see a lot of people on the private equity side saying, hey, prices look low. We want to start looking at Brazil. No one's pulling the trigger yet because they're still worried about how far things can fall. But the level of interest in the last couple months from our financial clients in the United States and even in Europe has absolutely increased. Not so much from Japan. Chris, do you want to have something to say about that?
I think that the interesting thing that we're feeling from our clients is the concern isn't so much in the medium term. I think if there's a broad view that there will be an upside. I think it's more our clients are trying to identify what's the size of the downside in the near term and to be able to identify the buying opportunity. But absolutely, I think that we're seeing a lot of interest with our clients abroad, looking at valuations, knowing that we're going to have a lot of companies potentially selling assets, including Petrobras. I think that they really see this as a real opportunity, but they're just trying to be able to handicap the size of the political mess over the next year or so.
All right, do we still have time for a last round of questions, I think?
How much time do we have?
Many people here. What about 20 minutes more? Or?
Yeah, it's okay. For me, yeah.
Okay. Is it all right for you, Ian?
Oh yeah, of course. I'm here as long as you guys want me.
Please, concise questions.
Okay.
Lots of people. Aí vocês se distribuem aí. Celso, Zé Roberto e Maílson aqui nesse meu. Por favor, assim, um esforço de reportagem.
Since I got the microphone first, and I have a new subject. I'm José Roberto from school, university in São Paulo, and I imagine there are a lot of people from São Paulo here, and we Paulistas have been worrying a lot lately about water. And you've mentioned other liquid so far very frequently, but you haven't mentioned a word about water. Now, is this an obsession of ours in São Paulo, or is it really such a big problem in the near future?
Thank you.
Two questions. One, do you think the issue of climate change is inserted into your evaluation about risks? Two, you mentioned a lot about Sisi. Would you like to make some additional comments?
Okay.
We are passing through some difficult times in Brazil, but after listening to you and having the overall view, I'm going to live here much more optimistic than I came on. Okay? Our problems compared to the problems you mentioned are very, very small and easy to solve. But what Brazil should do, we should do a passive attitude in time, wait and see what is going to benefit us, or we should have a more active role in terms of trying to benefit ourselves from this overall situation. And the second question, how you see the presence of China in Latin America? You certainly noticed about the agreement they did with the Argentine, which in my opinion was a tremendous setback for Mercosur. Do you have any view about China interference in Latin America?
Good question.
Ian, my question is about American decline. As you know, the idea was raised in 1980s. Japan should be then number one. Then the idea was raised recently, dies out, and come back again. I would like to see your opinion on the so-called American decline.
I'll try to answer these a little more quickly so that we have a couple more. On water, look, water is not a global issue. Water is a profusion of local issues, right? It's not like there's a global water market today. But you think long-term about India versus China and the dams that are being created and the Himalayas, and they'll have more water first as the glaciers melt, but then they're not going to have any. And if I think about India versus China over 20 years' time, I start worrying a lot about water. There's no question. The reason that the war in Syria happened is water. And the reason water happened was climate change. So I'll bring those two questions together, right? I mean, and I don't mean getting warmer. I mean, climate change means much more extreme weather patterns. So droughts and floods become more extreme where they hit. And in Syria, there was a massive drought, and the farmers no longer had the ability to, they didn't have feed because of the drought, and so they had to kill their livestock, and so they were starving, and so they rioted in homes. And after the riots, Assad cracked down hard on them, and 3 years later, We have 250,000 plus Syrians dead. We have 4 million Syrian refugees. We have 11 million Syrians displaced. Why? Climate. Why? Water. Yemen. The average Yemeni lives on less than $7 a day, and the Yemeni capital, Sana'a, will need to be moved by 2025 if it isn't bombed completely by the Saudis. So whatever's left will need to be moved because they won't have any more water. And desalination technology is too expensive. It's not there yet. It may be in 10, 20 years' time, but it's not there now. And so there's no question. All these people that get so excited about Africa, and they tell me Africa's coming, and I look at how much you're going to have forcible climate migration of people living in Africa who will not be accepted in new territories because of extreme weather conditions, because of water problems in the next 10 years, that's going to grow. Climate's not going to be a global problem in the next 10 years, but it's absolutely going to exacerbate the lives and the misery of the people that are in the weakest conditions. And some of that are the African states, the people now that McKinsey's saying, oh, it's time for Africa. And the other thing I worry about Africa is they're going to have 1 billion people coming into the labor market just when labor stops being important. Just when automation starts becoming much more important in manufacturing and in services. And over the long term, I worry about that. So I think Africa is going to become much more diversified. African governments that are governed well and that actually are able to diversify their economies will do very, very well, and lots of others will become absolute cesspools. And don't believe that this is like Africa suddenly coming. So that's water and climate change. I mentioned Sisi. I mean, there's no question that if the Egyptians had a full-on election today, Sisi wins big. He has rebuilt his relationship with the United States. He's absolutely got a great relationship with Israel and with the Gulf Arabs. He reflects stability. He reflects the Egyptian military, which never left power, even when Morsi became president. And I mean, the fact that he decided to he's the only major leader that's given a speech that said Islam must be reformed. Now, he didn't just do that because of ISIS. He did that because he considers the Muslim Brotherhood to be terrorists and wants to go after them. So I'm not saying he's a good guy, but I'm saying that this is a message. I do believe that instability in the Middle East comes from many reasons. I mean, some of it is bad governance, some of it is borders that are drawn that don't make sense, some of it is the US doing less, some of it is the economy getting worse, some of it is Islam is broken, and that you have a whole bunch of radical imams and clerics that are proselytizing hate and divisiveness, and no one in a position of power is willing to say anything about it. And even the Americans are saying, oh, it's not radical Islam. No, a big piece of this is radical Islam. And I'm not saying that because I don't like Muslims. I'm saying that because this is a serious problem that does exist among other parts of the world, but to a much smaller degree, and it's not being addressed. It is one thing that needs to be addressed. So I think that, you know, I'd love to see more of the Gulf Arabs actually respond to Sisi on that issue, but they won't. In terms of what China's doing in Latin America, I mean, I focus on how little they've done in Venezuela. The Chinese could really make a difference for the Venezuelans if they wanted to. They've chosen not to. I mean, first of all, they don't really need that quality of crude. But secondly, it's like, this guy's kind of a disaster, and we've got enough things to focus on in our own backyard. So, I mean, the Chinese are putting a lot of money, but they're putting a lot of money at stake in places where they really think they've got the short and medium-term gains. And that means Asia, that means overland through Eurasia, and it means sub-Saharan Africa, where they really can build it up. Latin America, I mean, frankly, it's not just that the Chinese still sort of see that as an American sphere of influence, but it's also that they understand that soft power from the United States is really, really high. I mean, all of the parents are sending their kids to American universities. And, you know, the influence, the ability to have influence in long term in politics does actually matter there. And people don't talk about it as much, but I think it's influential. So even though China is Brazil's largest trade partner, do I think that that buys them as much with Brazilian political developments in 10 years' time as it does in Mongolia or Kazakhstan? I think it doesn't, frankly. And I think the Chinese get that. So they're going to do more, and they do more in Mexico too, but I just don't quite think it has the same level of impact that it'll have in other parts of the world. And what do the Brazilians need to do? Well, look, you've got people here that can talk much more about that than I should, so I will defer to them on it. But I will say that clearly Brazil right now, from an American perspective, feels like India did before Modi, which is important market, over the long term, a player you just need to pay attention to as you think about the world, but without any real foreign policy orientation or strategy, right? And it would be nice if that changed. It would certainly be nice if Brazil got to a position that they could eventually want to be a part of TPP and the infrastructure the Americans are joining, expanded NAFTA, that kind of thing. But, you know, that's an American perspective. That's not a Brazilian perspective. So I'll leave that to my friends. But U.S. decline, I don't believe the United States is in decline. First of all, because, again, the geopolitical benefits for the U.S., where are you going to want to send your money? Where do you want to buy real estate? You know, you can be a Chinese patriot and still realize that, you know, it's safer for me to put a couple $1,000,000 in America than it is for me to have all my wealth in China, right? And I think that America's gotten very lucky with the energy resources it has. But America also has more ability to exploit them and to improve their value than other countries in the world do. America has gotten very lucky with its food resources. But the efficiency in food technology in the U.S. is extraordinary. You've got companies like Monsanto that are actually doing grain cycles and corn cycles that are 60, 70% faster. You can get an extra harvest of corn in the U.S. now that you couldn't get 5 years ago. That's extraordinary. And, you know, I mean, land prices have taken, you know, have really moved as a consequence in the U.S., right? So I think that's pretty exciting. And you talk to the desalinization people in the U.S., and they're pretty excited about the ability to move that technology. Talk to Coca-Cola and what they've been doing. Very impressive stuff. So, you know, I look at that. I look at American entrepreneurship. I understand the American middle class is not doing well, and the U.S. is also hollowing out in terms of labor availability, but nothing like Europe. Americans are still not only apathetic politically, but they're also hugely optimistic / narcissistic. And the great thing about that is even if the American middle class has no chance, if you ask them, they still say, oh yeah, our kids are going to be in the top 10%, which creates stability, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
Pew Research does these polls. In Europe, they all say, oh, it's going to hell, right? They don't say that in the US. So I think for all of those reasons, American foreign policy is in chronic decline, some of which has to do with the Americans, a lot of which has to do with the state of the world. But the United States is absolutely not in decline. I don't believe that at all. And I think that we'll continue to see that going forward. And maybe on Brazil, maybe you guys could say something about that.
No, you now.
Well, thank you very much. No, I just had a brief comment. You mentioned about the question of democracy in China, the issue of democracy. When I was living there between 2004 and 2008, many of my Chinese friends, they were either high-level officials or very rich, belonging to the new class of Chinese businessmen, which was created with Deng Xiaoping reforms. They worshipped Deng Xiaoping. They hardly mentioned Mao Zedong. It's understandable. But they mentioned to me that they would inevitably have to deal with the issue of democracy because China's prosperity is creating a very very large urban middle class. And they say that middle class always want to meddle into political affairs. And so it's something they will have to deal with. They are not meaning that they are favoring democracy or more modern means of representation, but they are concerned with the issue of democracy, which will, and at the time some people said to me that which will become important after the 2020. I would very much like for you to comment on that, if possible.
I do think that they have to deal with it. I think one of the great things about China is that all of the problems that we talk about in the West, all the problems we say that, oh, this is unsustainable, they know it. They're aware of it. And they're more concerned about it than we are because it affects them much more. And this is one. I mean, the fact that as you get an urban middle class, I mean, Shanghai per capita income higher than Portugal, their demands for accountability in China are greater. I mean, they focus much more on, we don't want growth, we want to breathe the air. We want infant milk that won't poison our kids. We want dog food that won't poison our dogs. And that absolutely, now that's not demanding, and so therefore you want dog food that doesn't poison the dogs that you're going to eat. It's the transitive property in China, you know, if A then B. I think, now those things are not yet about democracy, but they will be about more accountability of their officials. And I think there's a difference between wanting your officials to be accountable to you and wanting Western liberal democracy. And what I'm saying is I don't believe the Chinese people are going to have massive demands for free elections and multi-party state. But I do think that they're going to demand much more accountability of their leaders and much more decentralization, and say, I want our local leaders to be accountable to us. And the Chinese government so far has resisted that. They're worried about it. Now, by the way, when I say that things like Apple and Google and Amazon can't work in China, part of the reason is because the Chinese government needs that surveillance power. They need that filtering capability. They need to have more influence over their consumers for precisely this reason. And so over the long term, the Chinese must dominate what will become a very strategic IT space. And as we know, IT used to be about computers, but IT now is about companies in all sorts of different sectors, right? And that worries me because that really fragments globalization to a greater degree than we've seen historically. So I think this is becoming a real problem. But I mean, if any of you that read the Wall Street Journal, David Shambaugh, who's a very well-known sinologist, wrote a piece 2 weekends ago saying China's about to fall apart. And it has become fashionable in Western circles to talk about all this unsustainability and that this is going to hit next year in 2 years' time. And I agree. It's 2020 minimum before they start to have serious challenges with domestic political, sort of dissent in a way that might ultimately emerge in a Tiananmen-type way. And the fact that they are addressing and thinking about that now, years before it hits, shows the strength and the resilience of China's own political system. Yeah.
We're running out of time, but we still have time for 2 more questions. Ladies first.
Thank you. Could you talk a little bit about European elections now, especially in Spain and UK, now that cities are won in Greece? What do you think about Podemos and what are the risks? So, thank you.
I actually also have a question about Europe. You talked about Europe a lot, but you didn't actually mention the word European Union a single time. And I was wondering what role the European Union can play sort of geopolitically, especially with regard to Russia. And sort of on the same point, perhaps NATO too, which you only mentioned in passing.
Well, I mean, look, European Union is much more of an oxymoron than United States, right? And so that's part of the problem. And the Brits and the economist in Britain is particularly and keenly aware of that fact. I always sing the economist's praises, but I will say that on the Europe issue, there is a fundamental anti-Euro bias, right? I mean, I remember during the heat of the Eurozone crisis, the Economist ran something like 8 covers that showed the Euro imploding, fragmenting, falling off a cliff, bursting into flames, right? Yeah. And you don't like the Euro because the pound sterling is not that, right? No, it's like if you go to the Council on Foreign Relations in New York and you want to talk about the Iranian perspective, and the audience says, "What do you mean? There's no Iranian perspective. This is the Council on Foreign Relations." So I mean, even the best organizations have their institutional biases. By the way, Canada, people always say Canada's they're so unbiased, they're so fuzzy and Canadian. But go to Canada, try talking to them about Ukraine. They're insane on Ukraine, right? Because there are all these Ukrainians living in Canada with money. And you've got an election coming up. They're harder line than the Americans on Ukraine. Like, we need to send them weapons. I'm like, what? If you send them money can buy weapons. No one ever thought of that. So why do we have to send them weapons? It's very clear that the European Union has only German leadership and only reluctant German leadership. And that's a problem because, one, the Germans are reluctant and the Germans are not geopolitical in orientation. And second, because most countries that don't support Germany really would rather to have a broader gap of leadership, right? I mean, the Greek versus the German narrative is impossible. I mean, it's not just they hate each other. Their sense of history is completely different. The recent poll by Pew Research actually showed that Greeks with jobs work more hours than anyone else in the European Union. And yet the Germans persist with this notion that the Greeks are incredibly lazy and lethargic. I mean, the fact is, yes, some of the money that went to bail out the Greeks did go to the Greek banks, but much more of the money went to bail out the German banks. And how much are the Germans talking about that? Not at all, right? And so, I mean, and the Germans, of course, were more than happy to lend to the Greeks when they knew the Greeks didn't pay taxes. This wasn't a surprise to the Germans. They were, oh my God, they're not paying taxes. What happened to George? Oh, George was fired last week, you know? I mean, so the narratives are horrible in Varoufakis versus Schäuble. I mean, these are almost, they're caricatures of each other. I mean, you haven't yet done a column, I mean, a cover of Varoufakis and Schäuble, I don't think. You need to, because they're meant for The Economist. I know, but they're meant for The Economist. But no, now that Tsipras and Merkel are actually the ones talking, you have adults who are more willing to actually talk issues and less willing to just snipe at each other, and that's useful. But clearly, when we talk about the European Union, look, I'm very worried about the future of NATO. NATO is much more relevant than it was in the last 20 years, and it's so much more divided. I mean, what's going to happen when the Russians do more in the Baltic states? And the Balts say, we need help, and the Poles say, let's do it, and the Spaniards and the Italians say, no frickin' way. By the way, what happens if Greece leaves NATO? Which is thoroughly thinkable. I'll tell you one thing that happens, is that the Greeks veto further sanctions of the EU against Russia. Tsipras came out yesterday and said these sanctions are counterproductive, right? So I think the Russians actually, Front National, Syriza, Orban and Jobbik in Hungary, the Visegrad states, half of France. I mean, the Russians have a lot to play for. They actually have, you know, a few feet in the door with the Europeans. And if I'm advising Putin, I'm like, yeah, your U.S. relationship is broken, but you can really cleave off the Europeans, make them even more ineffectual at governing than they are, and you can help to ruin NATO. You can help to ruin NATO, and the Russians desperately want to ruin NATO. So I think that's a worry. And I do think the future of those organizations is very much in question. Not that I think that the Greeks are going to leave the euro. I don't think they will. But I do think that the ability to talk about strengthening European institutions to make the euro a stronger reserve currency, I think that is completely off the table. I think the Germans, I mean, until we know that the Brits are in, you can't have collegial effective leadership at the top. And what you really need is French elections, a British referendum that votes yes, and then you can have a triumvirate that really does compromise, and Europe can become effective again. How long is that going to take? Years. So for the next few years, ain't happening. And in terms of elections in Europe, I don't have much of a call on the UK because it's very, very close right now. I mean, I thought that with the Paxman interviews with Cameron and Miliband, I thought Cameron did a little better. And he's popular, there's no question, though many of his people are not. I guess if you made me bet right now, I would say we return the same government. It's going to be, again, Tory Lib Dem alliance. But I'd only make a 55% bet on that. We don't have a strong call. We just don't have a strong call. On Spain, we have a strong call, which is that, you know, you said, well, given Syriza, what do I see in Spain? Spain's nothing like Greece. There was no depression in Spain. The institutions have not been destroyed. You know, youth unemployment is bad, but not disastrous. And Podemos can't win. I mean, they can get into government, but they will have to, if they get into government, they will have to have a coalition with an establishment Spanish party, which is not what's happening in Greece. And so I think that the functional relationship between Spain and Germany and Spain and the Troika, the Eurogroup, will actually be much less problematic. And for me, the problem of Europe is not that we're going to see another Greece. The problem of Europe is chronic. It is greater populism. It's less sovereignty of national governments. It's more anti-establishment behavior. It's greater tensions between center and periphery. It's inability to build European institutions. It's massive numbers of migrants, many from Muslim states, that are causing bigger divisions within European countries. It's Turkey as a looming authoritarian disaster. It's Russia causing much more economic problems for the Europeans than the United States. I can keep going. So the politics of Europe are chronic, and they're not going to get fixed. Another reason why we like the Western Hemisphere a little bit more, right? No, I mean, Sao Paulo before Paris for an office, please. That's obvious. That's completely obvious, right? Especially because you need to, because at least in Brazil, if someone doesn't work out, you can potentially fire them, right? In France, it's over. You own those people for life, you know? So funny, last story. So Google is going all over Europe, and they're trying to digitize all of, like, you know, they did the Library of Congress, and they're digitizing all the libraries in all the European countries, and they go around and they hire a few thousand people in each country, you know, 500 in smaller countries, whatever, and it takes about 2 years to do it, and they're taking all of this work, and they're digitizing all of it, and they do it in every single European state, every one, except France. Because in France, the inability to hire workers, they needed 2,000 workers for 2 years and then let them go, was so great that it was actually more cost effective for them to take all of the documents, put them on rail cars, send them to Germany, hire Germans, fire Germans, and send them back to France. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.